In the year 1881, a photograph appeared at the royal villa near Munich that should have been destroyed immediately. A young Hungarian actor sat on a richly carved couch, and next to him, like a personal valet, stood Ludwig II, King of Bavaria, one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. According to strict court rules, this was simply impossible. The king never stood when a mere mortal had the right to sit. Only the mysterious status of this actor could have caused Ludwig to act contrary to protocol. When copies of the photograph reached the ministers in Munich, they immediately realized that this was not just a breach of etiquette. After more than 2 decades of carefully planned deception, the royal family's most dangerous secret was now available to anyone who looked through the lens. This single photograph set off a chain of events that ended with 2 corpses floating on the surface of the lake. The fisherman who pulled out the bodies kept silent for a long time in exchange for a large sum of money and was elevated to the rank of mayor of his modest village. The mysterious documents about what really happened that night are still classified as top secret in Germany to this day. We all know Ludwig II as the Mad King who built the fairytale castle of Neuschwanstein on a Bavarian cliff. 6 million tourists a year admire its spires and lace balconies, but almost no one mentions that each of these halls, each secret room and passageway, was created for one purpose. In the underground grottos lit by electric lamps entangled in wires, the king held his nightly celebrations, where he could finally live in darkness and love the one whom only his soul recognized in the darkness. In the darkness, Ludwig felt free. He discovered something that would have ruined his reputation if it had become known to the people and the courtiers. Here, amid the roaring waterfall under the glass dome of the artificial lake in Linderhof, he received his chosen guests and paid huge sums to servants who forgot what they had seen. But sooner or later, the wrong people found out about the grottos, and they decided that the king must die. On June 13, 1886, 2 bodies were found in the deep silence off the shores of Lake Starnberg. The first to surface was Dr. Bernhard von Guten, Bavaria's most respected psychiatrist, whose face was scratched and whose neck showed signs of strangulation. The second was King Ludwig II, the 40-year-old ruler whose clock had stopped at 6:54 p.m. The official version was suicide by drowning, but Ludwig was an excellent swimmer. Not a drop of water was found in his lungs, and the fisherman's boat was linked to secret payments that continued until the end of his days. And in gratitude, he became the head of his village. To understand how the king ended up dead in the lake, why the doctor was strangled, and why the fisherman was paid to keep quiet, we must go back to the moment when this beautiful, cursed prince first learned the terrible truth about himself. Munich, 1863. 18-year-old Prince Ludwig, heir to the throne and beloved by the people, met the man who would destroy his entire life. Paul von Thurn, a young adjutant, appeared at the royal audience in impeccable form, gold buttons, a dark blue uniform, and a posture like a statue. There were no unimaginably handsome men in the Bavarian court, but Paul was different. Something passed between them in the hall of the residence that was not described at all in the official vocabulary of the time, or was described in overly alarming terms. Soon they became inseparable. Paul would appear in the prince's chambers late at night when the court was already fast asleep. In the paper records, their correspondence was discreetly referred to as officer reports, but secret letters survived in the royal archives, spared only because they had been forgotten and not burned. Beloved Ludwig, my heart beats only for you. As soon as the light comes on in your windows, I know you are thinking of me. I am devoted to you with all my heart and soul, Paul wrote. Ludwig replied just as passionately, "You are the sun in my darkness. Without you, I cannot exist or sleep. I pace around the rooms like a caged animal until you return." But there were whispers at court. Servants reported, ministers kept their own records, and rumors spread in Munich's beer halls. The king's son prefers his adjutant to all the princesses who are his due by status. Queen Maria, Ludwig's mother, had to act first. She summoned Paul for a private conversation and, according to rumors, gave him an ultimatum. That same night, the adjutant left for Prussia and never returned. For Ludwig, this was his first bitter lesson. Love always ended in loss. However, something even more important followed this separation. The prince began to change his daily routine. First, he skipped morning receptions, then he stopped attending afternoon meetings altogether, and by winter, he was rarely seen in public before sunset. Thus began the shadow that would eventually engulf the king and destroy his reign. Imagine a king who fears daylight almost as much as he fears an evil enemy. In 1864, when King Maximilian II died unexpectedly, the 18-year-old Ludwig inherited the Bavarian crown. It weighed almost a pound, but to Ludwig it felt like 1,000 heavy obligations. Now he was expected not only to give public speeches and attend parades, but also to have a family, heirs, and continue the 70-year-old Wittelsbach dynasty. He could not live as before. During the day, he put on the mask of the perfect prince, noble, strict, and completely different from who he was in private. Even before ascending the throne, Ludwig loved dark halls and shady corridors. His intimate encounters with his valet Paul took place when the lamplight seemed too bright and court etiquette felt like a burden. He could only be himself at night when all of Munich was asleep and the official chronicles fell silent. In diary entries found only a century later, he calls Paul the light of my soul, and at the same time asks God for forgiveness for his sins. These passionate confessions are juxtaposed with pleas for salvation, for Ludwig's religious upbringing was not empty words. When the king announced his engagement to Princess Sophie, sister of the famous Empress Elizabeth of Austria, the courtiers patiently stayed up all night. In 1867, Ludwig promised to get married on August 25th, his birthday. Sophie was exemplary in her beauty and intelligence. She spoke several languages, played the harp, and was liked by everyone. But as the date approached, Ludwig increasingly disappeared into his dark chambers and arranged ambiguous meetings with court messengers. Finally, he summoned Sophie to an audience and confessed that he could not give her his heart. "You deserve a man who can love you with all his heart," he said, according to the princess's recollections. "I am not that man, and I never will be." Sophie accepted this, but later repeated, "How could I marry someone else after that?" She was mistaken because Ludwig did not love her at all. He was already captivated by someone else. In 1866, in the Bavarian stables, the king first noticed the groom, Richard Hornig. Blonde with blue eyes and features that seemed carved from marble, he reminded Ludwig of everything that was unacceptable in society, and at the same time attracted him more than any secret. Within a year, Hornig rose from a simple stable boy to the title of Master of the Stables, and soon became the king's personal groom. Ludwig gave him land by the lake, a generous salary, and what was most precious to the monarch, free access to the royal chambers. In his diaries, Ludwig called Hornig the healer of my soul, and at the same time chastised himself for his destructive passion. In 1869, he wrote, "I am cursed and doomed, but hell with him is sweeter than paradise alone." It was during this period, tormented by contradictions, that Ludwig conceived the idea of building Neuschwanstein, a castle straight out of a medieval novel. Towers peeking out of the clouds, narrow bridges that could be destroyed in an instant, and gloomy halls where every stone breathed solitude. Historians have long wondered why a king would want a castle without a throne. Ludwig had no intention of holding meetings there. Neuschwanstein was built for secrets. Servants could move silently through hidden doors and mysterious passages. There was a separate passageway leading to the bedrooms, and the ceremonial hall was decorated with mosaics of angels and knights, as if inviting visitors into a world of dreams rather than a meeting room. Slowly, his life changed its rhythm. Meetings were moved from 5 in the evening to 6, then to 8, and by 1870, the court was already functioning after nightfall. By 1875, Ludwig rose at 7 in the evening, had breakfast at midnight, lunch at 3 in the morning, and dinner at dawn. After that, he slept until sunset. His contemporaries attributed this to madness, eccentricity, or signs of a weak mind. But they all missed the point. The king had created a parallel kingdom that existed only in the twilight. It was inhabited by those who, like him, could not bear the bright light and stern gaze of society. At night, the quiet halls of the palace resounded with the operas of Richard Wagner, which Ludwig adored, conducting the scenes himself, waving his cloak and imagining himself as Roland or Tannhäuser. His shadow kingdom united musicians, artists, and those very secret lovers who could breathe freely without fear. In this world, there was pure peace and freedom. During the day, the Bavarians knew a humane king, poet and patron of the arts, but night revealed something else. The king was captivated by a dream of love that was only possible in the shadows. And Ludwig's secret kingdom has not yet been fully unraveled. In the azure twilight of the underground lake, lights flickered, changing shades of passion and jealousy. Tourists will not be told about this. The slippery truth about King Ludwig II is hidden behind the glow of lamps and the rustle of waves. His longtime favorite, Baron von Herwig, lived in the royal chambers, but he was far from the sovereign's only companion. Young actors from Munich theaters would show up here after midnight performances, and musicians would give secret concerts right in the Venus Grotto at Linderhof. This artificial grotto was built in 1877, and was sold to the public as a tribute to Ludwig's love for Wagner's opera, Tannhäuser, in which the hero visits the underground kingdom of the goddess Venus. In reality, however, the cave was a carefully controlled space for the most extravagant performances, the likes of which cannot be found in any other palace in Europe. Imagine 90 meters of narrow galleries, walls lined with pebbles and artificial stalactites, an underground lake heated to 28 degrees Celsius. Mechanical wave machines created a gentle surf, while musicians hid behind stone pyramids, performing excerpts from Wagner's operas. In the very center of the lake, a golden boat in the shape of a shell bobbed up and down, in which the king could drift for hours with a guest of his choice. The electric lighting provided by Bavaria's first mini hydroelectric power plant, which served exclusively this cave, was revolutionary. Soft red light transformed the grotto into Venusberg, a place of pure pleasure from Tannhäuser. Blue evoked the melancholy of the blue grotto in Capri, and green aroused feelings of jealousy. And in the blink of an eye, all the lamps went out, plunging the space into absolute darkness as soon as an unexpected guest appeared. Servants working the night shift were selected with particular care and received generous salaries, but even a sum of several thousand marks was not always enough to buy their silence. By 1880, alarming reports began to circulate in the palace corridors. Young servants were being forced to dance privately in Venus's cave without any form of clothing. One such report, compiled by an offended and dismissed servant, described scenes that later became the main argument of the king's accusers in his mental disorder. His Majesty demands dances that would be shameful even for Roman emperors. The corners are lit only by candles, and before the throne, set on a marble pedestal, young men are dressed only in wreaths of flowers. This evidence would probably have remained hidden in the ministerial archives had it not been for one event in 1881. a 23-year-old actor named Yusuf Kynes, who played Didier in a play based on Victor Hugo's work, arrived in Munich. According to audience reviews, the performance was neat but unremarkable. Nevertheless, the king sent for him urgently that very evening. For most artists, the thought of a private audience with an increasingly reclusive monarch was frightening. But Kynes was curious and ambitious. Their first meeting lasted until dawn, and no one ever found out what they talked about. But a week later, Ludwig asked the actor to go to Switzerland, not for a role or as a court artist, but as his personal companion. In May 1881, they left under the guise of Count von Berg and his secretary, keeping their route a closely guarded secret. However, in Lucerne, the king made a fatal mistake. He allowed a photographer to take their portrait. In the photograph, Kynes is sitting calmly in a wicker chair, his hand resting lightly on his knee, his gaze confident and slightly playful. Ludwig II stands next to him. The monarch is standing majestically upright, but his eyes are not focused on the camera, but on the seated artist. This gaze conveys all the hopelessness and passion of mad love. When hidden copies of the photograph reached Munich, the ministers were shocked. Not only was it a violation of royal etiquette, but it also revealed an intimate side of Ludwig II's personality that had been carefully hidden for almost 2 decades. Count Maximilian von Holstein, once a friend of the king and now his political enemy, hastily compiled a dossier containing everything he could find, not only compromising photographs, but also statements from dismissed servants, receipts for luxurious gifts to young favorites, and even excerpts from the ruler's personal diary stolen by a bribed valet. But Holstein understood perfectly well that homosexual orientation alone would not be enough to overthrow the monarch. The tragedy on Lake Starnberg still stirs the imagination. Was it an accidental misstep or a planned assassination of the king? Such is Bavaria, a land where aristocratic eccentricities were tolerated as long as they remained behind closed doors. But Ludwig II wanted something more, to prove that the monarch had gone mad. Enter Dr. Bernhard von Gutten, the kingdom's most famous psychiatrist and a man with big ambitions. He had never met the king, never seen him in person, and never conducted a single medical examination. But in March 1808, he presented a voluminous medical report. It was a masterpiece of medical quackery. Every quirk was turned into a symptom of a bad head: reverse sleep patterns, signs of dementia, private theatrical performances in the castles of Neuschwanstein and Linderhof, delusions of grandeur, friendship with men, pedigree instincts, and moral insanity. Reading between the lines, von Gutten hinted that Ludwig was not ill, but inconvenient. By 1808, the king's debts exceeded 14 million marks, and the royal treasury was depleted by the construction of fabulous castles in the Alps. However, his increasingly frank relationships with men and nightly gatherings of his select circle were becoming much more dangerous for the aristocrats. A shadow monarchy in exile erected deep in the forests threatened to come to light. The conspiracy unfolded rapidly. On June 10, 1808, Ludwig was declared insane and unfit to rule, and his uncle, Prince Ludwig, was appointed regent. A commission headed by Dr. von Gutten set out for Neuschwanstein to arrest the king. Rumors of the coup reached Ludwig a few hours before their arrival. Loyal servants who had kept his secrets for decades warned him to flee. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, his cousin Sissi, the only one who truly understood the king's passion for solitary fantasies, prepared carriages at the border. But Ludwig hesitated. Where to run? What is the meaning of life for a king without a crown? At 4 a.m. on June 12th, a commission burst into Neuschwanstein's bedroom and found the king fully dressed, as if he had been waiting for them. When von Gutten, looking at the man he had declared insane for the first time, asked Ludwig, How dare you declare me insane without even examining me?" The doctor replied coldly that the documentary evidence speaks for itself. Ludwig was sent to Berg Castle on Lake Starnberg under the pretext of treatment, but everyone knew that it was not a hospital, but a prison, and that the king would not leave it alive. On the evening of June 13th, less than 48 hours after his arrest, Ludwig asked von Guten to take a walk along the shore. It was getting dark, a light rain had passed, and the wind was dying down. The doctor, perhaps succumbing to guilt or excessive self-confidence, dismissed the guards with the words, "The king is calm. We are in no danger from a mentally ill person." At 6:30 in the evening, they left the castle gates, and at 8 o'clock, when no one had returned, the search began. About 25 meters from the shore, 2 bodies were found in shallow water. Ludwig was an excellent swimmer, but he was found face down with no water in his lungs. His pocket watch had stopped at 6:44, von Guten's at 8:10. The doctor's face had scratches and nail marks, and there were signs of strangulation on his neck. The official verdict came in the morning. The king had first drowned von Guten, and then himself. The case was closed, but nothing added up. A strong swimmer in shallow, warm water, no water in the lungs, the king's coat with 2 holes, looking like bullet holes, according to Countess Josephine von Verberkowitz, disappearing immediately after the autopsy, and the silence of the fisherman Jakob Liedel. He found the bodies and soon bought the villa, and a year later became mayor. In private notes found only after his death, he confessed, "I prepared the boat. The king wanted to escape, but when he approached, a shot rang out. He fell chest first into the water." Liedel took the secret of who gave the order to shoot and why with him to his grave. Some documents about the death of Ludwig II are still classified by the Bavarian government. In 2007, historians demanded that they be made public, but they were told that the materials were too sensitive. But perhaps the greatest paradox is not how Ludwig died, but why he had to die at all. Already deposed and declared insane, he posed no threat, unless he knew too much about the allies who shared his secrets and whose power depended on the king's silence, whose courage to live in a world darker than the darkest legends of the Alps. Imagine, under cover of night, the candles in the castle go out, and the tables are left full of ashes and charred papers. Shortly after Ludwig II's death, an uncompromising purge began. His personal papers were confiscated from the royal office, and the most secret ones were burned to ashes. The servants who had attended the nightly receptions in the famous Venus Grotto received generous pensions and signed ironclad non-disclosure agreements. The grotto itself was sealed under the pretext of repairs, which dragged on for years, and scaffolding unknown to anyone was erected along the dark corridors. Richard Hornegg, the king's favorite, instantly disappeared from the courts of Europe. For 30 years, he wandered in the shadows, giving no interviews and writing not a single line about his relationship with the monarch. Joseph Knies returned to the stage and became one of the most brilliant German actors, but he never dared to perform in Bavaria again. In a Munich magazine in 1910, a few months before his own death, he bitterly remarked, "The king was the loneliest man I knew. He built castles in the air because he had no place in the real world." But here's the paradox. These very airy castles made of stone and steel outlived their creator. Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, and the castle on the island of Herrenkirchen. The Bavarian authorities, who were quick to declare Ludwig insane, opened them to the public a few years later. As early as 1892, the first tourists set foot on the snow-white towers of Neuschwanstein. Today, Neuschwanstein alone brings Bavaria more than 50 million euros a year. The king's mad whim turned into a gold mine. The very same king who hid in the darkness and dreamed of a world where one could love without looking back became one of the most recognizable rulers in history. Millions of tourists photograph his grottos, speculate about the romantic monarch's fantasies, and fail to notice the most important thing. Before them stands a man whose thirst for true love and freedom was stronger than his fear of being himself. Lake Starnberg still holds its secrets. The German government is in no hurry to declassify documents about that fateful night. And locals claim that on foggy evenings, mysterious lights flicker over the water. Not lanterns or torches, but something soft like moonlight where there is no moon. They say it is Ludwig II still trying to reach his boat, to flee to a place where kings can love, where night becomes day and fairy tales come true. The Mad King is dead. Long live the Dreamer King. In 1808, Empress Elizabeth of Austria and Hungary wrote in her diary, "He was not killed for his madness, but for his freedom. True freedom is what power fears most." Ludwig II died at the age of 40, having spent less than 200 nights in his luxurious palaces. But in those brief hours between sunset and dawn, in the kingdom of shadows, he lived more honestly than any other monarch. 138 years later, we are still wandering through the labyrinths of his hidden dreams. But 138 years later, we are still wandering through his dreams, trying to understand the lonely, hidden king who loved in the darkness of night and died in the light of day.